have, and that most people are on sites like Facebook, it leads the internet to be less anonymous than it was. And if we can all agree, and I think we did, that anonymity causes some of the problems that we talk about on the internet, then that's kind of a mechanism to resolve that.
But I think I think you need to rethink the question. It's a flawed question. The idea that technology can improve culture is simply the wrong way of thinking. Turn the question the other way around. How can culture improve technology? Otherwise, we fall into the old trap of having too much faith in technology. We become digital utopians, and we wreck everything. So I would strongly advise you to rethink that question.
So I actually want to take the other side of what Andrew just said, which is I do think that there is...
Don't rethink the question. That's the...
Don't rethink the question. No, the second half, when he said we should think about how culture can reframe technology, absolutely correct. Nothing wrong with that. But we also need to recognize that there's an interaction between technology and culture. When I talk about at the comments field on the Wall Street Journal, and we all say anonymity is a problem there, that's a technological issue. It's a question of how is that common board designed? When we think about at Wikipedia, why does it work as well as it does? Partly because of all the tools that the core community has to block people if they're causing trouble, and all the subtle things behind the scene. That's technology. So I do think we need to think about how can we advance the tools that we have on the internet in a way that can help to enrich and empower people to have sane civil spaces, because it doesn't happen automatically.
But Jimmy,
and that's where your question was going.
Tools are by definition cultural. So you invented the notion of the wiki. But the wiki as technology isn't interesting. It's only interesting in a cultural sense.
Yeah, I didn't invent the wiki, by the way. But you're right. There's a complex interaction. My point is, if you have a flawed technology like a message board where nobody's able to do anything about the worst horrible person who shows up, it turns into a cesspool. And if you have a technology that allows a community to say, hey, you know what, we're trying to accomplish something here. If you can't behave yourself, you're going to have to leave. That can become something. And so there is a relationship between the tools that we create and the culture that we get out of it. And it's complex. It goes back and forth.
Great. Thank you very much.
My name is Ken Bernstein. I am a high school government teacher, and I'm a blogger. And as you might figure out, my blogging name is Teacher Ken. But my question I think I'm going to give to you, Mika, and the phrasing of it goes like this. We've heard a lot about the need for editorial control or whatever else, and we've also heard that's from over here, and we've heard from over you the empowering of new voices. So I'd like you to explore two facts. Washington Post gave back a Pulitzer Prize, Janet Cook, because it wasn't vetted. New York Times, Judith Miller. I'm not going to say any more about that. In the case of Judith Miller, part of that being exposed, and a number of other cases being exposed, were because of bloggers who weren't edited, who dug and put things up. And the blog has created some very important new voices, most specifically Nate Silver at 538.
Well, it's an excellent point, and I think this is why I'm optimistic about the future. I think we're seeing a kind of hybrid form evolve as some of our best journalists from legacy media embrace the tools, the interactivity, the direct responsiveness and accountability that blogs injected into the public conversation. And they had to be dragged in some cases. They had to be shamed in the cases that you point to, the Times, the Post. Both gave themselves big black eyes for those errors. But the hybrid that we're getting, and it's because there's competition from this unmediated blogosphere that Andrew is so afraid of, is that journalists are now discovering that if they interact with their readers, if they treat their story or their column or their post as the beginning of a conversation and not the word of God that the expert handed down, they can actually develop a richer, better, more informed story. And often the audience, that well-informed audience, passionate amateurs, as the people that Jimmy talked about, are the ones adding value. So the net effect, if you will, is a much richer and better kind of journalism than what we had before.
You know, there was one thing I want to just jump in for a second. Andrew made the point we're ducking one key issue. The key issue is the economics. You'll pardon me for taking your time, and thank you, Ken. We're ducking the issue of economics. He just talked about the New York Times, the Washington Post. Well, if you didn't have those organizations, people wouldn't have been able to uncover what was wrong in those cases. Neither of you responded to that. Jimmy, you want to respond to that?
I think it's a real problem, and I don't think that we have a good answer to it. And I'm not so much concerned about the New York Times and the Washington Post and the major media covering what Obama's doing. We've got lots of people doing that. I'm really much more concerned about what's going on at the local level. If you have a local newspaper that's laid off half of its journalists, there's a lot of local things that aren't getting covered, and I don't think we have a really good solution to that.
The gentleman, what was his name?
Ken Bernstein.
Ken, I give a lot of speeches about this stuff, and at the end, someone always stands up, and I call it the Judy Miller moment, and he just did it. He brought up Judy Miller. Why? Here was a woman who was a corrupt journalist. She ended up in jail. She was a bad journalist. She was outed, not necessarily by the blogosphere.
She's not corrupt.
Well, she was a bad journalist.
She was in jail for defending her source.
But she was a bad journalist, and she did no credit to her trade. But the idea...
Well, but let's just clear up the fact that Judy Miller went to jail not for being a bad journalist. That's simply unfair, right?
Well, in any case...
Maybe the Judy Miller moment, but let's give her...
But the point is that we fall into this
and you wrote a book
trap
called The Cult of the Amateur.
But we fall into this trap of generalizing an entire profession around a single bad example. So this, I always say, someone sticks up their hand and says, what about Judy Miller? So I say, what about Judy Miller? I mean, for every Judy Miller, there are thousands of honest, professional journalists. So I think we have to be very careful about allowing that kind of comment to smear an entire profession. It's like me sticking out my hand if we're talking about politics and using an example of one bad politician or one bad sportsman to vilify an entire profession.
Nobody disagrees with that, I take it.
No, that's absolutely right. I think we have to be very careful about using anecdotal examples of any kind.
But there's a salient reason why Judy Miller comes up, because the single biggest failure of the mainstream media in the last decade was the failure to raise critical questions about the rush to war in Iraq. And I picked those examples of fake expertise for a reason. So I'm not going to let Andrew get away with this. When our institutions fail us that badly, it is a moment to ask these hard questions about why. So it isn't just her. It was her editors, and there were other reporters who fed us the same misinformation that built the rush to war, and now we're still paying for it.
Can I come back on that as well? Because I think that this is, again, a very comfortable... I wouldn't say it's an illusion, but it's an oversimplification. There were journalists at Knight Ridder who were very critical of the war.
Right.
There was a guy like Robert Fisk, who I follow, one of the great journalists of the post-war age, who was working for a professional newspaper, the London Independent. There was the French media, there was the German media, there was the London Guardian. The problem was a collective American problem. You cannot blame it on mainstream media.
Okay,
it's too
fair
convenient.
enough. Fair enough.
Very good. Please. No, you can't have the mic. You can only talk to them.
Okay. The better examples might have been Stephen Glass and Jason Blair, if you're going to point fingers at journalists who've gone wrong, as opposed to someone who went to jail for defending a source, especially in this place. So that's one thing. So my name's Alex Howard. I'm the Washington correspondent for O'Reilly Media. And it might be useful to focus more, I think,
for O'Reilly Media?
O'Reilly Media.
Tim O'Reilly.
That's Tim O'Reilly. He's in the ebook publisher, not the Fox.
Not Bill.
Because the Fox has taken some lumps tonight, so I'm not associated.
I think there's a big heaved sigh of relief in the room.
So O'Reilly's more closely associated with things that are open. Open standards, open source, open ebooks, things that are free of DRM. And the question this week might be one to ask around open government, especially since we're here in Washington. This week is the year anniversary of data.gov. Now, if you're not familiar with data.gov, that's the site that was put up by the White House after they issued Open Government Memorandum, and then that was followed up by an Open Government Directive. That's White House policy, right? That's coming down from that quarter. Same bit right down.